welcome to our ongoing conversations on the review by a book by Adam Smith on an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So we've had 8 episodes so far. This is the 9th session, and we are looking at book 4 of Systems of Political Economy. And in this session, we'll be discussing chapter 7, 8, and 9. So chapter 7 is of colonies that Moses will take us through, and then chapter 8 is conclusion of the mercantile system. Kwame will take us through that, and chapter 9 is of the agricultural systems, physiocracy, and Jairus will take us through that. So the objectives of this series is to appreciate the enduring power of ideas over time. As students of economics, we seek to understand to what extent the ideas we propagate will stand the test of time and whether they're truly new. And we also want to find out whether Adam Smith's ideas remain relevant in our contemporary society. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Moses to start us off with chapter 7 on of colonies. Moses, go ahead.
So I'll be taking us through chapter 7 as stated, and chapter 7 is of colonies, where Adam Smith tries to do 3 things. So this chapter has three parts. Well, it's among the biggest chapters in the book, so quite extensive, but interesting, especially for the lovers of history. So part 1 talks about what exactly were the motives that led to colonization. And then chapter 2 talks about the effect, especially on what caused the prosperity of the new colonies. And then on the third part, Adam Smith looks into what benefits did Europe accrue from the colonies that they colonized in this case. So on part 1 of the motives of establishing new colonies, Adam Smith takes three colonies. So the Greek, the Rome, and also the European colonies. So what he distinguished between them and tried to understand, why did the Greeks colonize some countries? Why did the Roman Empire colonize some countries? Or let's call them some places. And then the European nations, and why they actually colonized some countries. So starting with the Greek colonies, which were among the very first ones. So Adam Smith argues, and we'll see why he argues this, that the Greek and the Rome colonies were based on a necessity. And starting with the Greek colonies, Adam Smith notes that in the Greek region, population grew very fast. And therefore, this brought 2 things. There was a strain on the territory that they occupied. That's one. And there was necessarily a need to get new habitation for these people. And that was the basis under which the Greek colonies came about. Now, Adam Smith noted that whereas it was probably what would have happened is the Greek region would have probably, or the communities that in this case are within this, would have expanded to their neighborhood. Due to the way society lived, the neighbors would have likely fought back, and therefore it would have been quite a difficult stance to seek new habitation within the neighborhood. And therefore, these communities that lived in these places sought new habitation in different places. And Adam Smith says that they started in Sicily, which of course would turn out to be Italy. And the reason why is, of course, because they couldn't, of course, occupy their neighborhood because there were people there, and that would have led to conflict. One of the characteristics of the Greek colonies was that they were an independent state. Remember, it's let's call them, quote unquote, the excess population that trickled down to new habitation. And they were allowed to form their own governments, and therefore they were not under control of what Adam Smith called the mother country. And they were also allowed to make their laws, and they also allowed to determine their own judicial system, so they were to select their own magistrates. And therefore, in totality, they also now had their own governments. And Adam Smith notes that this was one of the major difference between them and the other colonies that we are going to look into. Now, when the Rome Empire came up, also, remember the Rome Empire was formed under the agrarian laws, meaning that their main focus was in agriculture, and therefore land was very paramount to them. And these agrarian laws also were limiting because land used to be passed down based on human affairs. So whether it's marriage, whether it's succession, so land basically passed down to some people or to some families. Now, what this did, it created richer families and poor families. And one would imagine, and Adam Smith notes this, that the poor families would probably lease or rent the land from the rich so that they do farming. But this did not necessarily happen. And one of the complications of this, or the reason it didn't happen, is because of the availability of slaves. So the rich people, instead of leasing their land to the poor and also giving them some of their land to do cultivation, they could utilize slaves not only to do farming and production on their lands, but also to ensure that the trade of whatever was produced. So the slaves were utilized in this case. I'll say this, but I'll go into this later on as I discuss prosperity of colonies. But Adam Smith notes, he uses the word the unfortunate laws of slavery, meaning that Adam Smith did not support slavery in this as described in this chapter. Now, given this peculiar nature of the agrarian laws that existed in the Roman Empire, what happened is the poor people started pushing back to the rich because they also wanted space. And therefore, the Roman Empire decided, since there was no possibility because of how much power the rich had acquired through ownership of land, there was no way they would have pushed them away or subdivided land. And remember, the agrarian law already had limited the amount of land one person could own, and this was 350 English acres. This was equivalent to 500 in Italy, or in the Roman Empire, they measured it then, but in the English acre, it was around 350. And therefore, this necessitated that the people, especially the poor, to move to new territory to seek land so that they can also be productive and be able to meet their needs. And that's how the Rome colonies came up to be. Now, one of the things about the Rome Empire was that they were also allowed to have their own way of managing their affairs, but they were not allowed to be independent government. Unlike the Greek colonies, which were allowed to have their own governments, the Rome colonies were fully under the Roman Empire government, and therefore, in this case, there were no independent governments. So they were a kind of sort of cooperation. So they were allowed to make bylaws for themselves, but these laws could have been revised, corrected by the mother country. Remember, Adam Smith uses the word mother country to mean the colonizer in this case. So both, like I said, as I was starting this, both the Greek and the Rome colonies were both formed by what Adam Smith called irresistible necessity. There was clear and evident utility, Adam Smith says, for why these colonies had to be formed. And Adam Smith notes that these colonies were mostly formed in places where there was thin habitation and there was a lot of uncultivated land, which is understandable because most of these communities were farmers. Now, Adam Smith goes to other category of colonies, which are the European colonies. One of the things that you notice from Adam Smith's work is that he didn't go into the European colonies that were in Africa. So he only tackled European colonies in America and the West Indies. It's good to note that due to navigation, the world was almost divided into two. There was the East Indies and then the West Indies. So it was mostly divided into, because based on navigation paths. And therefore, the West Indies here mean anything that is to the west of. So it's the western side of Europe in this case. So America and all that. And Adam Smith noticed that the European colonies, unlike the Greek and the Rome colonies, was not formed based on necessity. It was based on other agenda. And so he narrates the chronology of how we got here. So the Venetian community, which had specialized in waterways, so this is navigation, commerce, this is selling and buying and exchanging of things, and also cunning diplomacy. So the Venetian community tried to go to different places where different groups of people lived and all that, and using their diplomacy, trying to interact with them and know them. And so once the Europeans noticed this, it inspired the Portuguese to actually also seek navigation, both in the American, mostly in Brazil, and then in Africa, and also in Asia. And the other Europeans observing the Portuguese, and they note that although the Portuguese project, this navigation and trying to follow the Venetians in trying and see the seaways and all that, had not beared much fruits, the Europeans were worried that in case it did, they would be left behind. And therefore, they also started their separate projects. And that's where Columbus comes in and his navigation to America, which Adam Smith says he discovered new land or new territory. Now, remember, for Columbus to justify government support for whatever he was doing, then he needed to also show that it would be important and it would be profitable to whatever European nations that were interested in that. But his project necessarily did not land into places where they would have gotten especially new products. And this is because Europe was way advanced. Then, actually, Adam Smith called them civilized nations and called the others a bit savage. So once Columbus did not realize that the land is mostly uncultivated, there's not so much to exchange with these people, he changed the importance of this, and now it became all about looking for gold and silver. Well, even so, the gold and silver that was available was not that significant. But either way, that became a justification on why this was a good venture. And so, remember, population bulge, need for land for the poor were the reason why the Greek and the Rome colonies were actually formed. But Europeans were just trying to keep up with the Portuguese and also trying to see what they could benefit. And therefore, it was not based on a necessity, it was just based on exploration. And that's the major difference between these three colonies. Now, Adam Smith notes something that due to the fact that the colonies or the European colonies were not formed by a necessity, there was a likelihood that they would not have been beneficial both to the colonizers, which Adam Smith called mother country or countries, and also to the colonized, which are the colonies in this case. So the next part, which talks about the benefit that the colonies or what led to the prosperity of colonies in this case. But before we do that, it's important to notice that Adam Smith takes note that Christianity was also used as a weapon in the European colonies. And allow me to quote directly, he writes, the pious purpose of converting them to Christianity sanctified the injustice of the project, and the project here was colonization. So Adam Smith noticed that the European colonizers also used Christianity as a way to justify their project, necessarily because there was not so much benefit that they were actually getting from these colonies of themselves. So part 2 talks about the causes of the prosperity of new colonies. Remember, when I mention European colonies, Adam Smith, I don't know why he did so, but he doesn't talk about the African colonies. When he considers European colonies, he talks about American and other parts of the West Indies in this case. So remember, Europe, as considered by Adam Smith, was civilized nation. And then he described the other countries in two ways. There were West nations or they were thinly inhabited. So the population was low or the lands were uncultivated. Now, given that the other places had higher population, especially in the Roman Empire and the Greek region, these colonies provided lands, and some of them were fertile lands, so they were good lands. And also, it provided people, especially people who had been oppressed and treated badly in their own region, to move to other places. So, what caused the prosperity of new colonies? Now, remember, there are two categories: those that were given more freedoms, like the Greece colonies had the freedom to form their own government, to determine their own laws and their own judicial system. Others one did not have much opportunity on that. So Adam Smith noted those that were given more liberty tended to grow more rapidly than the others. So he noticed, given that these countries had very big tract of lands, most of these land were fertile and good, and now the entry of Europeans or Romans or Greeks meant that since these people had already been quote unquote civilized, meant they had better technology and better mechanism of production. And what that led is to they started cultivating the uncultivated land, which automatically, because of the vastness of the land, led to higher wages because the demand for labor went short. Number two, because of the amount of technology and knowledge that was possessed by colonizers, it was passed down to these places and to these colonies, and that ensured that their production went higher. And also, mother countries, and these are colonizers, provided markets for the surplus production of these colonies. And therefore, colonies got extensive market. And this was some of the major reasons why they actually were able to prosper. And mostly this was on the Greece colonies because they had more liberty and they also were they were not required to pay more levies to their mother country. Now, the Rome colonies did not have as much freedom, and therefore they did not experience rapid growth as the Greek colonies experienced. But Adam Smith notes that because the technology had already been passed down, and the fact that the lands that were uncultivated were put into use, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Rome colonies got a chance to actually grow rapidly, not before, after. Now, on the other hand, the European colonies also had good lands, especially in America, and therefore they also had technology passed down to them, and therefore they also accrued benefit from that. One of the things is that the European colonies were under very tight laws. They needed to pay some levies, and the laws were made away from them, so they were determined by the mother country. But Adam Smith noted, because of the huge distance between the colonizers and the colonies, that it gave them an advantage. So most of the laws, although the colonizers of the mother country, as Adam Smith referred to them, tried to enforce them, did not necessarily affect them too much because of that distance, and of course the cost of implementing this. But Adam Smith distinguished two things. He realizes that when you take now the European colonies, there was two approaches. There were countries that concentrated their focus on the colonies, and there were those that neglected them because they felt they were not that important or they did not accrue them much benefit. For example, Spain ensured that they were always tracking and always controlling what was happening in their colonies. On the other hand, the British colonies were heavily neglected, and this is because initially England felt that there was not so much benefit to accrue. And Adam Smith notes that over and also under the neglect of the British and also the over control of the Spaniards was both detrimental to their colonies. And the neglect because the technology passing down and also the helping these people to utilize their land was slow. And also the over it's because the over control made people feel as if they were not really doing this to their best interest. They were trying to serve somebody else's interest, and therefore they did not, as Adam Smith told, they did not put their best efforts, and also they had no incentive to be innovative. Now, Adam Smith, under this part, he also goes down and decides to focus on the English colonies, especially of North America. And why he focuses on this is trying to understand why did they prosper? Why was there a difference in them compared to other colonies? And he notes that the political institution of England and the one that was passed down to their colonies was important because of one thing. It created an improvement on the lands and also it boosted cultivation. Now, how did this happen? One of the things is that of all the other colonizers of the mother countries, England restricted engrossing of land. Engrossing of land is mostly where land was heavily passed down based on human relations, like succession or marriage, and therefore land necessarily not passed down to the people who would make it more productive. It heavily remained on people who were advantaged by their family having owned it before. So the fact that that was not mostly implemented in the English colonies, it meant that land would be passed down or be sold or leased to those who would put it into more use. And that also was also because in the English colonies, there was no law that of what land should go to the firstborn. In other colonies and other laws, it was required that land is heavily just passed down to the firstborn. But in the English colonies, they heavily accepted that everybody should get a share. So everybody in the family, so land was heavily subdivided, which was important in this case. And it's good to note that these were very big tracts of land. So it was not being subdivided to be small scale, although it was smaller than before, but it's like being divided into smaller portion, enabling more people to own it, enabling more people to make it more productive and all that. And therefore, you also notice that the English colonies had moderate taxation. And he notes, given that the English colonies just ensured that they had very lean governments, with the revenue that was needed to be collected or the taxes that were needed to be collected only needed to maintain the basic of the judges and the governors. All other revenues that were accrued by those who were in the production line belonged to them. And therefore, what it meant is they were able to use that to develop their lands to be more productive. Unlike other colonies, which not necessarily demanded that they pay levies to the mother country, they also had to pay some of these taxes to their own government and all. And now, on the other hand, the English colonies were allowed to sell to England, and therefore they had an extensive market. And this market was important because in England they were richer, so they had higher incomes. So the market was not only extensive in terms of size, it was also extensive in terms of ability to afford some of these products. And well, the English colonies had one peculiar thing. There were products that were enumerated, meaning that the colonies were only allowed to sell those to England, and there were those that were not, and those could be sold to whatever country. Now, the enumerated products were sold to England, and then England would consume or re-export some of them. Now, this approach of of England on their colonies made their colonies prosper better, heavier and faster than others. And on the side note, like I stated, Adam Smith notes that it was unfortunate that some of the richer people both in the colonies and also in the mother countries used slaves in their production line. And he notes that use of slaves, and especially in free countries, he says that slaves had a better chance in a country that was less freer. And in this case, it means the mother countries, the mother countries and the types of laws that were governing the colonies, that they had a better chance where the countries was not free. Because of this reason, in free countries, it meant if rich people owned slaves, they were at liberty to do with them whatever they wished. In other countries, it meant the government could intervene if it felt the slaves were being treated badly. I think this is the only point where I see Adam Smith notes that maybe freedom here was not a good thing for the slave. It would have disfavored people in this case. And he notes that it was unfortunate that people used slaves. And he says that if people had treated slaves in a freer manner, then that would have been better, because these people would have had the pride of what they were doing, and therefore they would be more innovative, and probably they would have produced more than they did. And they would have an incentive to do better for whoever they were in service of. But since the approach was slavery, then they only did what they could have done for their own survival. So now, the lands, the passing of technology, and technology here is just a way of doing things, in a better way of doing things. And then, of course, the liberty ensured that colonies prospered. Now, on the other hand, Adam Smith asks, what benefit did accrue to Europe? Now, we have checked on what led to the prosperity of the new colonies. Now, part 3 looks, Adam Smith looks, did the European nations benefit from colonization? Now, he has 2 categories of benefits, and one he calls them the general advantage, and then there's the peculiar advantages. Now, he notes that the European nations had an increment in their enjoyments due to their new colonies. And this enjoyment came from the fact that, and this one now it's heavily European, the Roman and the Greek colonies were not discussed in this part. And he says that the American colonies produced some goods, and these goods used to be sold in the mother countries, which was in Europe. And this meant that the Europeans had more variety of goods to choose from. They had more convenience because, of course, with the variety. And this meant that they could enjoy more pleasure from them. And of course, the fact that in their colonies, there were ornaments that used to be developed, and to mean that they also had this for beautification and enjoyment. And in that case, this spread across the European nations. And the reason it spread across is because the benefit were not accrued to specific colonizer or specific colony. Because once the surplus was sent to the colony, in case there was monopoly, in this case, of where the colonies could sell their products, then the colonizers of the mother country would re-export them to fellow European countries. And therefore, this extended to all European nations. The other thing is that there was a augmentation of industry, and this is production and farms. And how this came about is also that new colonies were not just producers, they were also consumers. And therefore, the mother countries or the colonizers, in this case, got an additional market where they could have sold their products. And what that meant is that they increased their production. Unlike before, where most of their sales were just based on their neighborhood, they now had places to send their production. And this now led, once increased production happened in the mother countries, it meant that the locals, the Europeans, had more income based on these increased sales. And that, of course, means if they had more income, there was also increased local demand for local consumption of the production that happened locally. Now, also in this case, Adam Smith notes that these advantages were greater, but they were great, but they would have been greater if countries did not monopolize where the colonies would have sold. Adam Smith notes, by England requiring that its colonies sell some of its product, which fell in the enumerated category, just to England, it meant that what that happened is due to the monopolization of price setting, meaning that the colonizers determined how much was paid by for the goods. It meant that all capital that was in England was mostly directed towards production in the colonies. Now that slowed down and killed some of the local production and farms that were in England. Remember that people were seeking profit, and therefore, since they had the monopoly of setting the prices for their colonies, and given that the colonies could not sell to other nations, both that were colonized or those that had colonized other colonies, it meant that they didn't have an extensive market, so there was no competition, and therefore they relied only on the market that was provided by their mother country. The mother country also determined the prices. But Adam Smith noted, if England and colonizers did not take this approach, they would have accrued more benefits. One, because their local industries would not have had little capital to deal with, because most people are directing their capital to where they can monopolize the prices, meaning they can have higher profits. And number two, it would also not have accrued debt. Remember, given that they had to buy the products from their colonies, meant if their colonies could not pay to consume the goods that were being sold to them, then they had to be done in a debt obligation. And Adam Smith notes that for this to be fully paid, it would take 3 to 5 years. And therefore, it meant that not all capital was being put into use, because some of it was laid into debt. Now, on the other end of peculiar advantage, what did specific colonizer get from their colonies? And one of it was military force. Now, these apply differently depending on the three colonies. For the Roman colonies, they both offered military help, and they also were levied, so they needed to pay taxes to their colonizers, their mother country. On the Greek colonies, they were not required to pay any revenue, but they were also required to draft some people into the military for the Greeks. And now, on the European end, due to distance, they were not necessarily able to draft soldiers into their military from the American colonies. And therefore, what this means is when war happened, the American colonies would fight as allies and not necessarily as subjects of the European counterparts in this case. The other peculiar benefit, say from the military force, the revenue, which is taxation that the colonizers levied on their colonies. There was also exclusive trade. And Adam Smith dug a lot into this, both distinguishing why this was a bad practice and why it discouraged the mother countries from growing, and also slowed down the growth that the colonies would have gotten in time. And he notes that the consequence of exclusive trade was the fact that one, capital was the trade-off of capital from the local companies now had little capital to deal with, because most people went to where they could monopolize the prices, so slowing down. And therefore, it also meant that the debt that came with buying these and also selling to the colonies meant that all capital was not used into productive use immediately. Some of it was deferred to the future, and therefore the economies did not grow as big as they would have done. But Adam Smith noticed this, that the progress of both the colonies was great, but this was not necessarily, and I quote, that the consequence was not necessarily because of too much attention or neglect from the colonizers, but it was despite of it, meaning that the passing of the technology, the fact that these people had big lands and all that was important. But he emphasized that the plenty of good land and liberty and allowing people to manage their own affairs was the greatest cause of prosperity of all new colonies. And he says that the colonizers, Adam Smith does not use the word colonizers, that's my own. He used the word mother countries. The mother countries would have benefited greatly if the only thing they did is out of necessity, they allowed the excess population, quote unquote, to move to new lands, put into use the good uncultivated land, and also learn from the knowledge and the technology that the European nations had already discovered to improve their land, and therefore increase production, and then allow free trade so that all the production would be sold to anybody and anywhere. So Adam Smith condemns slavery. He condemns the protectionist approach the colonizers took, and also he paints out where freedom was not necessarily a good thing, especially for slaves, because it means that the government could not intervene on how those who had slaves treated them, including killing them and all that, as he notes in the text. And therefore, he says it would have been an advantage for slaves, for those who lived in places where government would actually intervene in the liberties of those owners of slaves. In conclusion, Adam Smith ends by saying that to prohibit a great people, and I'm quoting directly, from making all that they can of every part of their own produce, or from employing their stock and industry in the way that they judge most advantageous to themselves, is a manifest violation of the most sacred rights of mankind. Both Adam Smith did not have a problem with people moving to new, thinly inhabited places, but he had a problem when the people who moved there and the government from where they were coming from took total control. He says that that's a violation of the sacred rights of mankind. And he notes that it was in the best interest for people to move in our cultivated good lands and put them into productive use. And the best way they could have ensured that there is maximum profit is ensuring that people also had the freedom to use the land the way they wanted, to produce whatever they wanted, and to sell it to whoever they felt they would create more advantage on it. Now, I know we'll discuss this later in the plenary, but it's good to state that you should note, and this don't mean that protectionism, which is, I would say, quote unquote, a darling of Africa, an African state, and Kenya, to be specific, is as old as colonization. And it didn't work then, and it's not working now. For people and governments who hate, and we just had an African France summit here in Kenya, and Kenyans who are quick, and Africans and other people who are anti-colonization, just like I am, colonization wasn't a good thing, were quick to remind the French president that we still remember the evils of colonization. And protectionism is one of the evils of colonization. And it's kind of funny that we embrace it. We think it's good for us, even though it's not, and it hasn't worked for over the years. But I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Moses, for the elaborate discussion on chapter 7. If I'm to quote you, you said, a quote from Adam Smith, protectionism is as old as colonization and didn't work then, and it won't work now. Now on to chapter 8. Kwame, you can take us through the conclusion of Mercantile system.
Right. Thanks, Melody, and thanks, Moses. Okay, so if you remember, we're on chapter 4, and in chapter 4, what Smith is talking about is describing of systems of political economy And he says, and of course, over the time, we hope we've made it clear through sequences in the chapters, that the predominant method of economic organization at that time, where laws basically and households were subjected, that households and people were subjected to, was a mercantilist system. And the mercantilist system is the belief in the superiority of gold or currency, per se, rather money, and the belief that exports are good, imports are bad, and the mercantilist system tries as much as possible to defend domestic production at the expense, if that is so, of imports. So imports are bad, all that. So it's an import substitution system, basically trying to get an import substitution system here. And it works in many ways. So a mercantilist system is not just about what trade is. It's also actually one of the things that provided the impetus for colonialism. And as Moses has explained, part of the colonial enterprise, and many people forget, it was actually granting specific rights to companies, which were the first. So if you're in Kenya, which is where we are, as we discussed this, you remember that the British government was established in Kenya. Basically, the colonial government was through a charter that was given to the Imperial British East African Company, which then was replaced by the establishment of the British government in the early part of the 20th century. But the IEA, which was a company running on behalf of a charter given to them by the British monarchy or the British government at that time, was the basis. So that was a mercantilist experiment. A mercantilist policy at work. So it's not just by government restricting import, but it's also saying that, look, let's go out there and conquer the world. And conquest in general, imperialism as a form of thinking, is basically based on a mercantilist ethos. So in chapter 8, we are speaking about the fact that in all the examples that is given about how mercantilist governments, or rather how mercantilism as a system operates at that time, one of the things that Adam Smith is doing in book 4, chapter 8, is basically it's called on the conclusion of the mercantilist system. In other words, Adam Smith says that, look, I've argued by principle about why mercantilism is wrong, and so this is like the last word. And here, we'll all accept that there's been a scathing critique, if I must say, of the economic theories that were dominant at that time. And Adam Smith says it actually looks like he's saying that he accepts it is in the minority, and he's trying to use principles and a little bit of data, which we see quite a bit of throughout the book. One of the things about Adam Smith is people get the impression that because this was an old book, he was actually data-driven. Some chapters have quite some data, including the chapter 8 that we speak about here. But I think Adam Smith is trying to say that, look, I hope I have persuaded you that the mercantilist system subverts natural order. Adam Smith has argued that the natural order of economic affairs is a basically specialization, leads to division of labor, and that makes people wealthier at farm level, farms, as in producers, whether it's households, individuals, or all that. And that in turn is what creates the wealth of nations. So prosperity of nations is based on government allowing people to do specialization, division of labor, get better output and better productivity. And that is the consolidated success of all those individual endeavors pursuing specialization at their own interest is what leads to prosperity. But he thinks that mercantilist system subverts that natural order of the economy by putting the interest, or rather subjugating the interest of the consumer to that of the producer, and producer-led policy making. And it's also something that is connected to political power. So Adam Smith says this is wrong, and the mercantilist system just is not fit for logic and for prosperity, because, as he says in the chapter, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. Something that many people forget, including even in Kenya when government gives subsidies, and I'll be coming down to subsidies in a while. One of the things that people say is, no, we cannot just be a consuming society. And yet, Adam Smith says, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. In other words, the reason all of us work, and working is production, is so that we might consume. Even if we save part of that production, the end result of everything is production. Is consumption. So when you think about it, placing production or consumption subordinate to consumers is actually a perversion of what that natural order. Basically, you subvert it. And I think the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it helps to promote consumption choices of people. Clearly, mercantilism does the opposite, because the mercantilists have many ways of trying to distort that natural order of things. And they try to persuade government because they have political power. Why do they have political power? As is suggested in all these examples that we talked about, the people who actually benefit from a mercantilist system tend to be the producers. In many cases, producers are more organized and they are smaller, and they have political power. You can bet in Smith's time, they're mostly bureaucrats or people who are in the aristocracy, because they're the large landowners and the kind of people who are interested in preventing themselves from competition, especially external competition. And for that reason, persuade governments to put harsh and barriers to imports so that they themselves can benefit from that. So that's a fine. So what are some of these instruments that they use? So now he's talking about the policy instruments that mercantilism applies. And one of those is subsidies. Though Smith doesn't call it subsidies, he uses the word bounties. And if you remember that bounty also means something that basically is gained through criminal endeavors. But he meant bounties. In those days, bounties was actually a broader word meaning as well, subsidies. So every time he applies, he uses the words bounties in the bounty throughout the book. I am reminded that he's talking about subsidies. And he argues that subsidies to exporters are essentially taxes on domestic citizens. So many times, even in our modern world, people actually talk about, well, why isn't agriculture subsidized in Kenya? And I speak about Kenya because this is where I live and whose realities I have studied to a decent level. Why aren't farmers in Kenya subsidized? Because even farmers in, say, France, the UK, they assume that, or even in the US are subsidized, as if bad policy somewhere else justifies the adoption of bad economic policy here too. And the idea, the bad thing about this is when you subsidize a product that cannot compete globally, what you're doing is that you're actually not subsidizing domestically, you're subsidizing consumers of that product here. So for instance, if Kenya chose that we decided to manufacture phones, or for instance, computers, right, which this country has attempted many times, or vehicles, and you decide to subsidize them for the purposes of export, then what you're doing is you're subsidizing, say, a Malaysian, for instance, if they would deign to buy Kenyan motor vehicles. That's what you're doing. So mercantilism is doing the opposite of what you want, basically. It treats the consumer as a tool for the enrichment of manufacturers and obviously merchants in general. So that's basically one. So that's one of the things that argues. So these forces, and one of the things about bad bounties and subsidies, and in Kenya, our bounties and subsidies perhaps go into the area of grain, maize farmers. First thing they do is they make sure through their organization to ensure that government has that view that maize is a very special crop. And therefore, it's important for food security, whatever that means. And then we have words such as food sovereignty, that we should eat on our own food. And then you go up with policies that do two things. One, you subsidize farmers through fertilizer. And the idea is, you've had it, even economists who should know better, saying that you should subsidize production, not consumption. Smith would disagree with them, and so would I. And then after that, you say, we cannot import maize from South Sudan, from Uganda, from Tanzania, or whoever else wants to, before we have exhausted maize from Kenyan farmers. And then you say that the National Cereals and Produce Board is going to import maize, or rather is going to buy maize, when the world price or the regional price is 2,000, you're buying it at 4,000 shillings, right? What you're doing is forcing capital and people's taxes into less than optimal industry. So keeping an industry that has no pressure to be efficient, gaining even a much higher price. So that's what bounties are. So in a way, in the use of the word bounty, that is what is doing. The farmers who are subsidized, and they're not necessarily all farmers, because very few farmers have surpluses to sell. But those that have huge surpluses that go into the national cereals and produce boards are actually pickpocketing, my own words, the consumer, or the taxpayer in Kenya, because government then subsidizes them by giving them a premium on their production. There are also instances, as Smith mentions, that there are also exports on raw materials. And exports on raw materials are known. Even in Kenya, some people say, look, there's no reason to export avocado before they're mature. Let's wait for them to be mature. So somebody else deciding on your property, if you're an avocado farmer, and avocado farmers are beloved of all Kenyans to consume avocado. So your favorite farmer, your superstar farmer, is being restricted from exporting his own because one, either because Kenyans have to consume it fast, but usually so that somebody can decide what is the appropriate level of maturity that is required so that as transporters or as people who process it, they can get the best deal. And it's often said that this is to help domestic manufacturers or to help domestic producers. And because of that, they asked the state to ban export of raw materials. In Adam Smith's example, he gives the example of wool. And I think this is so important that let me even say it. There's a time you should remember England, and there had a lot of farmers who kept sheep. And they're saying because local manufacturers wanted the wool, which was produced at a much competitive price, and they didn't want to import wool. So one of the things that they did, they were actually restricting farmers from selling their own wool outside the country. And they say, if you were within 15 miles of the coast of England, every time you sheared or you shaved the wool from your own sheep, you had to tell government within a specified period how much wool you're keeping in your store. And if you transfer it and sold it to somebody else, that person who's receiving it would then have to also have to inform government. In other words, your wool produced on your own land, produced through your own labor, produced through your, shaped through your own labor, sheared through your own labor, shone through your own labor, and kept in your own stores, but somebody else wants to know how much you have in your stores. But that's not even enough. There was a law, and Adam Smith goes through laws one way or the other, throughout, and he says there was a law that said that for the first time, if you ever decided to try and export wool on your own, then you would lose your properties to be expropriated by the state. So that's a first offense. For a second offense for trying to export wool without informing government, and you remember you don't have the right to, so it's a few people who would actually have to take it to manufacture it. In other words, you're being forced to sell it to one person. If you did it without that for the second offense, you lost your life. You'd be executed for trying to growing your own property and trying to sell your property. Look at what that means for property rights. And that's just as recently as 250 years ago. We still hear in certain places where people decide that there's a national interest in mercantilism. You cannot export this or that product up here. Many countries have them. I mean, right now, a comparable case is in the US, where for national security reasons, certain materials, such as computer chips on the cutting edge, right, cannot be exported to specific countries because it is considered an advantage to the state, to that country, and that it would be a security advantage. Adam Smith would disagree with that, even though people say that there are certain exceptions that are allowed for national security. But the problem with using that for national security, then you start to have nonsense or bad thinking, such as even food is a national security question. You need national sovereignty. I see people shout that, including on Kenyan TV, about food sovereignty. I don't know that they know what they're doing, but they appeal to the emotion, which is that, look, food is such a basic thing that if somebody wants to conquer you, so they still have the imperialist mindset, which is that imperialism is what every country pursues. They can conquer you easily by denying you the opportunity to buy food from them. I'm yet to see an example of a country that conquered another entirely from the use of food trade and that reliance, especially exchange. I'm not talking about people who starve our society, which would be genocide in today's understanding. But so they are contemporary. So in a first, he talked about bounties, then he talks about restrictions on the export of raw materials, broadly defined. And then the third one is basically providing monopolies for firms into the domestic market. So you say, you ban imports, domestic manufacturers or a domestic producer or an aggregator can then charge high prices. And in my view, this is a conspiracy. So industries, especially in Kenya, come in here. You might call them cement or all those other things, and decide, keep us away from steel from, say, China, or steel from Germany, or whatever else, or South Korea, and you ban imports of specific products so that you can have local farms. So basically, this is economic nationalism, right? so that domestic manufacturers or domestic producers of a certain product can charge higher prices. Why? And that ban is only necessary or effective if their prices were actually higher. If they were lower, you wouldn't need that because they'd even be able to export. And I think Smith mentions a specific one. I think he calls it a conspiracy of the few against the many, because the producers, so for instance, in Kenya, we have a ban or very high tariffs on steel imports, certain categories of steel imports. And often when you look at it, there are less than 2 farms. Sometimes it's just even one farm, a monopoly that is going to benefit. And you understand why they have a keen interest in preserving that, because they go up there, they're very organized, they speak kindly to people in specific offices, might be in parliament, might be in economic policy making decisions that they get that. So these mechanics of distortion, Smith points out quite a bit. And in the book, he mentions important examples, including flax. He mentions indigo from the West Indies, which was a dye. He mentions all those things where basically, as Moses mentioned, the imperialist mindset. So when a colony is established, a country then decides that because we established this colony, in many cases, first colonies were companies given a charter by the sovereigns to go out and they'd be protected. But often what happens then is once they get it, they will be told that whatever products you get from that country must be brought exclusively into this land. So that's the second thing. And the third one, basically, political economy, therefore, here tells you that a mercantilist argument is basically one of vested political interests. So they're not necessarily economic competitors, but they compete by having access to influence to decision makers, in many cases legislators and sovereign people. And they do not arise from a genuine concern for national wealth, because they don't. But actually, by raising subsidies to specific farms, export restrictions of raw materials, and providing monopolies at home, there's an argument that you're helping the domestic, but you're not helping the country actually raise its wealth, which is what Smith wrote this book for. But it's actually just succumbing to the political influence of the best and the most organized interest groups. And I think this is true again. So the consumers, who are the majority anyway and dispersed, are many, but they're not as vocal as a few producers who have access to PR messaging, who have access to the media, and who have access definitely to political decision makers. And even then, sometimes they're capable of inducing, in good or right ways, or even intimidating members of the legislature with nonsense such as, well, we will leave, or we will not export, or we will fail to employ people. So that's basically one of the things. And so there are significant lessons for today's policymakers, but that we will discuss in the second part of this. In all, I think that Smith has done a fantastic takedown of the system of mercantilism. Does it still exist? It does, because it's formed, and the politics and the rhetoric that supports it comes down to not only manufacturing and products. We get to the point where in this country, people are trying to tell you what music should be played on radio stations, private radio stations, in order to ensure that very talented singers who claim they're very talented but want to use government's force to force other people to make them listen to the noises that they make in the name of creativity. Thanks. Mercantilism should be defeated.
Thanks, Gary, for that elaborate presentation on Chapter 8. Jairus, you can take us through Chapter 9 of the Agricultural Systems Physiocracy.
This is the last chapter in Book 4, that of the systems of political economy. And the title, as Melody has mentioned, is of the agricultural systems, or of those systems of political economy which represent the produce of land as either the sole or the principal source of revenue and wealth of every country. I like the opening paragraph for this chapter, because actually following the two chapters that are just been presented by Moses and Kwame, and he says that the agricultural system of political economy will not require so long an explanation as to that which I thought it necessary to bestow upon the mercantile and commercial system. And so if Smith didn't have a lot to say, I think I should also be able to pick just up the few things that he says and not
oversay them. So firstly, and as those who came before me have argued, he was against this mercantile system, and that is actually what Kwame said last. But here now on of the agricultural systems, he has a problem with this. People who believe that agricultural systems or agriculture could just be the sole or actually the sole source of revenue and wealth of a country. And this is what he says, that that system which represents the produce of land as the sole source of revenue and wealth of a country has never been adopted by any nation. And he's trying to be kind and says it only exists in the speculations of some clever men. That there are some clever men actually, which I think are French philosophers, who felt that agriculture, actually labor in agriculture and agricultural produce, or the produce of land, was the only produce, like it was the only source of wealth for a country. But in reality, we know that that cannot be, and some other sectors actually contribute to revenue of a country as well as to the wealth of a country. If you take for our own case of Kenya, agriculture, though is the dominant sector with contribution to GDP of above 20, it's not the only one. Actually, 22, 23% is just a fifth, slightly a fifth of the country's wealth. So just the same way the Smith, I think he was right to disagree with him. Now, because of the transition he's making from the discussion on mercantilism, he frowns upon one guy called Mr. Colbert, who was a minister at some point. And the problem is that this guy was a mercantilist and preferred overregulation. And in agriculture, this was very excessively used because they preferred some sectors to others. Now there's a problem even in agriculture because, and this was not just in France, but in a lot of European countries, where export of, like, for example, for our case, France here was banned. And even the just transportation within the same territory, it was banned because of the beliefs. So there was overregulation of that. So there was that ban on exportation, and then even the just transportation within the country. And another thing that now added to a bigger problem on this was arbitrary taxes, which, according to his conclusion, he says that it discouraged agriculture. He observed that with all these bans, suppressions, and now add these taxes, even the produce was now, it was so little. If just the agriculture was just left to run on its own without all these things, the produce would be more. So he disagrees with this mercantilist overregulation, especially that were championed by this Colbert. And then I think that's something we can relate to today, because even at that time we had preference of some areas for production than others. And the observation he's making here is that it was so excessive in that time that even they could suppress production in some areas just in favor of others. But again, now the biggest issue in this conversation of agricultural systems was that agriculture was taken to be, especially in these places. This actually was a proposal or a belief by some French philosophers who believed that just agriculture was the sole source of wealth. And so it was to be more preferred. And that meant we have even restrictions to trade and manufacturing. Now, what was so controversial here was that because of that belief, it was said that it's only agricultural produce or labor that was counted as actually agricultural labor that was counted as productive. It was the only that added value, and so all these other activities outside agricultural production, all activities that went into the production of agricultural goods were not considered as productive. And actually, the term used is that they were classified as barren and unproductive, and so did not add any value. And so the classes of people at that time, or in this subject 2 or 3, that we had landowners, we had the laborers, so those who were contributed to this, and then we had the merchants and manufacturers. So to quote him, he says that actually this was the observation of this system is that the labor of the artificers and manufacturers never adds anything to the value of the whole annual amount of the produce of land. And so the argument here was that as much as there's something they're doing, the only thing they're doing is to replace capital employed. So it was like they're only preserving capital that is employed in the activities they're doing, but they're not adding any value. And Smith actually disagreed with them on that. He even used an analogy whereby of a family where we have, of course, parents, mother and father, and 2 children. So according to these guys, because it's just replacement of the 2, then that's not productive. But for a family that has 3 kids, then that would be productive. And so I think what he says then is, I think I'll come to that. So there was that interference because of some preferred sectors. And so Smith thinks that even for countries that are very blessed with land that is very productive and therefore can produce a lot of agricultural produce, they should not suppress industry that is manufacturing through duties on trade and manufactured goods. And his thinking is that would make goods expensive and even would hurt agriculture or the surplus of the value of land. And so he discouraged that. And he discouraged that, and then continues to say why it's important to just have freedom to allow all these different sectors to perform better, because that would create more capital. And so he says that the continual increase of surplus of the surplus produce of their land would create a greater capital. That is when we have we've allowed for more freedom, so that even the manufacturers and the other merchants are able to employ their capital in more productive areas. Then that still would add value to even agricultural surplus. He goes on to champion for this liberation or more freedom in the application of that. And he says that according to this liberal and general system, therefore, the most advantageous method in which a landed nation can raise artificers, manufacturers, and merchants of its own is to grant the most perfect freedom of trade to them, and so that they're even able to trade across borders. Because the problem here was that now we have those restrictions, and therefore value we're only seeing value in the production of land, of agriculture, but not in the other things, when in essence that's actually where some production happens or value addition happens and is important for creation of surplus. So he brings up two issues that this operation of manufacturing and trade is bad, and therefore it hurts even the interest of agriculture. So he says that those prohibitions or restraints have made the price of all foreign goods expensive. And another thing is that they have given that monopoly to the home market, so that because we have this limited access or limited participation of these manufacturers and other skilled laborers. Now the concentration is just in the home market, and actually economists today will tell you that now disturbs the allocation of capital, because now some will have to withdraw their capital, and now when you have a fewer ones, we have a situation where they maximize their profits. So profit only goes to a few of these people. So basically, he has a problem with the classification of people, where he says that we have only said that labor that goes into agricultural production is what we call productive labor, and then the others even that goes into processing, that's manufacturing, we say that is barren and unproductive. And as I said earlier, he used that analogy of family, and he disagrees with that. According to him, just because there's some superior class that it has more production doesn't mean it doesn't qualify to rank the others as unproductive. And then he moves now to make two important things. He mentions that yes, this group, these philosophers have made us to believe that it's only labor in agriculture that counts as productive. But then he reminds us that actually that labor, just besides actually now even beyond what goes into agriculture, labor, to be able to increase the wealth of a country, then we need to improve on the productive powers of labor, and also increase the quantity of that labor if the goal then is to have a more wealth country. And according to him, even now the labor outside agriculture, what these guys called unproductive labor, has even a better chance of being more productive, and therefore adding more value or generating more wealth, because those in the manufactures and trade, there is a higher possibility of division of labor. It's even easier. It's easier to do the division of labor, and even and specialization. So division of labor and specialization is easier at that point. That is in the manufacturing and in trade, and even improving on those skills. And overall, then he says that as much as he disagrees with this system and their beliefs and what he thinks it's coming closer to some truth on, it's like it's a system that was better at that time, because it comes closer to truth on this subject of political economy. But their view was narrow. That's according to his thinking, that they had a very, very narrow view of productive labor. And as we have discussed this, just taking one segment to mean that that's productive labor, and then the other, which today would seem to be even more productive, as unproductive or barren. That was a very, very narrow view. Towards the end of this chapter, he has some praise for economists, and he says some three things that economists have helped to able to change understanding of this subject. And he says that one is that their works have certainly been of service to their country, because they have been able to bring into general discussion many subjects which had not been examined earlier, and by that influencing in some measure the public administration that was in favor of agriculture. Yeah, remember earlier we said that we had so many restrictions of where it happens. There was preference for towns, and even in those areas that are not preferred, they could be suppressed. So the work of economists have helped to improve that administration. Secondly is that, and here he was speaking of France, that those operations in labor, in agriculture, at least in France, have now been lessened. And third, which is very, very important here, was that those restraints that had been placed or were put in place to ensure that there was limited transportation of produce from one area of a country to another. In France, he uses province, from one province to another, and even exportation, that is trading with foreign countries, it was lifted. And actually, we had some now law that would guide us into foreign trade. So, and that he gives that praise to economists for having put knowledge together, which has helped to achieve this. He gives us examples of countries, and that is China. China favored agriculture more than other employments and had little respect for foreign trade. I think if Smith was writing this today, he would use another different example, because of course maybe there are some things that have not changed, but some have changed, and we now know that China has some respect for foreign trade. Yeah, it's one of the largest participants in international trade. And then secondly, he mentions another important thing towards the conclusion, that the perfection of manufacturing depends on division of labor. And as I stated, he believes that even the labor in manufacturing and trade has a better chance to be more productive because of the division of labor and specialization, and a chance for that to be even made or to be improved. Oh, he also mentioned that foreign trade actually was a chance for transfer of knowledge and technology. And he used the example where China now would borrow from Japan at that time. And just one last point to support his decision or his stand on rejection of that classification of labor, where the labor that goes into manufacturing, which according to this group was just assumed to be just one that's just for sustaining them, just replacing the capital employed in them and not adding any value. He thinks, or he gives that example of clothes, that if a cloth was just plain, it would attract a different value compared to if it was dyed. So just by dyeing, that would mean there's some value that has been added through that processing, and therefore the price would be different. And if you look in that chapter, the examples that he gives on the values, there's a really, really significant difference between that plain one and the dyed one, and that is just because of that value addition by dyeing. And remember, earlier we said that because of this overregulation, we had even restrictions just trade within regions of the same country. And so Smith argues that the greatest and most important branch of commerce of every nation, as already observed, is that which is carried on between the inhabitants of the town and those of the country, which for us would say in rural areas. That when we have, and of course, like for societies like Kenya, of course, in rural areas is where some or most of agricultural production is done. And so therefore, when we have that trade between towns and those countryside, then that will be very important for wealth creation. So lastly, as he completes this chapter, he revisits the key argument that was there earlier, and therefore he says that those systems therefore which prefer agriculture to all other employments, in order to promote it, and of course with that belief that it's the sole or the most important source of wealth, and therefore because of that, because they want to promote agriculture and therefore they restrain manufacturing and foreign trade, he says that they act contrary to the very end they propose. So that by prohibiting, by limiting, by restraining, that is commerce, that is foreign trade and manufacturing, we are even now contradicting the bigger goal or what we believe that it's towards wealth creation. And so as he ends this, he already gives us the idea of what he will discuss in the next book. That's the fifth book of the revenue of the sovereign, of course, because this wealth also forms part of revenue to the sovereign. And so as he gives us that bridge to the next book, he tells us there are just three things that in the natural, like in a system of natural liberty, there are just three things that a sovereign is required to do. And actually, if you look at them, this will be important to support wealth creation, that is. And he mentions three things. And the first is protecting society from violence and invasion of other independent societies. So that's on sovereignty. And I think ordinarily we'd have defenses or armies now to protect that from happening. The second thing he mentions is the duty of that sovereign to protect every member of the society from injustice or oppression from within. So the first one was from violence or invasion from outside. The second one is from within, from among each other. And that would be through the administration of justice. And so, according to him, sovereign must put in place ways of being able to resolve issues between individuals or societies within the society, so that even the weak are protected, and therefore we have an environment for creation of wealth. And lastly, that is on the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works. And I think that would also entail public goods, and which are one of them, of course, will be able to serve the first two that we mentioned, that is protection, either from externals, from outside the country, or from just within themselves. And therefore, that's where he ends the chapter. So in summary, I think he's restating that agriculture is not the only source of wealth. And that idea has carried on by those other philosophers in France. They were wrong, because, and this can be proven if we use data for most countries, even resource-rich countries, I think would have some little diversification. And also that classification on labor, I think that was wrong. And so we believe, I'm sure that I agree with him that also manufacturing and trade, the labor that goes into them is as well productive. And the third thing is on that freedom to trade, removing those restrictions, either within the country or outside, and allowing people to put their resources or capital in productive ways. Actually, he uses the word that people should be allowed to put, people should have that liberty to put or to enjoy, yeah, I'll just quote him directly, that people should be allowed to pursue their interests in their own way. And so that freedom would allow even for better revenue generation, and therefore wealth for a country. And lastly, just which is just reinforcing on what the main part of the main argument, that would be that labor in productivity in labor is the most important thing in wealth creation. And just as he argued, even labor that goes into manufacturing and trade, and trade that is has a better chance to be more productive. That's through specialization and division of labor. And therefore, it's not barren, or yes, as some people believed earlier, which he has disagreed with them, and which I also agree he was right to disagree with them. So I think that would be the main argument he makes in this chapter. Yeah, thanks, Melody.
Thank you, Jairus, for your review on chapter 9. If I'm to summarize the 3 chapters, I'd use 2 words: freedom and liberty. On chapter 7 of Colonies, if I'm to give one statement, I'd say that nations grow wealthier when people are free to move, produce, innovate, and trade across borders without restraints imposed by monopolies and colonial restrictions. And then of conclusion of the mercantile system, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. Therefore, prioritizing consumer welfare will ultimately lead to a nation becoming wealthier. Chapter 9, one statement I would give as a conclusion, as a summary, is the wealth of nations is advanced when individuals are free to produce all productive forms of labor, not just merely agriculture. So from the three discussions, we've seen that what is screaming or coming out from the three chapters is freedom and liberty. And based on that, on those three chapters, I'd start with you, Moses. Do you find the ideas propagated by Adam Smith still relevant in our current situation?
Well, of course. One of the things I think that maybe we should consider it, especially with given this was talking about colonization. Adam Smith calls the need for people to move and the need for people to go where they can find ways to be productive as an irresistible necessity. Whereas colonization was a bad thing, especially because it limited other people's freedom and also relegated some people to subhuman treatment. It's important that we actually understand that the need to move, especially where you can be more productive, remain important to this day. And this movement of people is only valuable when they go to where they can be more productive, if they can also be allowed to sell or exchange whatever they're producing, to which that they can get the best advantage. And that's the only way nations and also the world would grow better in terms of trade and all that. And given this perspective, and especially considering the level of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, which is among the most protectionist continent, and also the one that with the most restriction in terms of production, that the only way we are going to make to ensure, the only way Africa is going to make sure that it utilizes its people ability, its resources, is one by opening up to trade, therefore allowing exchange of technology and allowing them to specialize their resources in where they can best be specialized. And of course, removing the barriers of taxation. Like Adam Smith noted, moderate taxation in some of the colonies was so important, having lean governments and leaving the biggest portion of people's produce to themselves rather than taxing them on and being given to government is important, because it's only when people have an incentive, are incentivized to produce through profit will they do that. And I think that's relevant to this day. And that observation that uh, limiting exportation of some products and also limiting importation of other products is disadvantage to a country. Like Adam Smith noted that nations best prosper when they are led to the freedom of knowing who to sell to, when to sell, and what to sell. At the end of the day, it trickles back. And Adam Smith noted that when people could sell to other people what they were producing more efficiently and buy what they could not, it meant that they had more income and it would support their local industry. But one of the most important things, I think we mostly, and I've seen worries in Kenya about this, Adam Smith notes that people are likely to sell first to the people nearby. Because one, the transaction cost and time taken to sell to people from very far distance is too high, and it defers using of capital and incomes today for later. Well, the financial system nowadays are better, so that has been quickened. But what that tells you is that there's no risk that people will sell everything away from a country and leave its people to starve. The first market are the nearby market, and they're more advantageous. And there's now that risk that we keep assuming that if we allow, for example, the milk farmers to sell their milk where it's most valuable, then it means that Kenyans will never have an opportunity to get their own. Or we decide that we will not sell our macadamia nuts to wherever they are being demanded, we'll need to create more value on it. I think at the end of the day is that if selling things, whether in their manufactured state or in their raw state, depending on which creates more advantage to the person, the producer, the private individual, that should be allowed to them rather than limiting it. Because at the end of the day, it's allowing people to benefit from the risk they took rather than government deciding to decide what risk, what benefit people accrue from the risk they took. And I think to this day that is relevant.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Moses. So, Kwame, what advice would you give policymakers based on Adam Smith's conclusion of the mercantile system?
Okay. Well, I think in some of the things that Adam Smith was saying about the fact that, remember, he says in the chapter 8 of book 4, somewhere that laws are often, many times laws are written by the producers because the producers are better organized, they have greater access to people to make decisions in government, in the legislature and all that. I think this is an early indication of what now many students of economics call regulatory capture, right? Because those who want to, who have an industry to protect and they're more organized than consumers tend to be the ones who plead with government to take certain positions or to write into law, codify into law policies that are protective or policies that help through tax exemptions, import bans, or licensing restrictions, which help the incumbents. But basically, what this tells us is that to guard against regulatory capture, we have to think about transparency in the legislative process. That's an essential one. And so that reminds me as a Kenyan that the public participation laws that exist, we should not think of them as nonsense. I mean, the transparency around them actually could help us to strengthen, because we know the strong incentive that people face to go into rent seeking. I think the second one is just basically, even in Kenya today, people still talk a lot about protectionism. Why should we protect our farmers? Why should we protect Kenya's industry? And the belief is that protection, whichever way it is defined, or local industry protection or infant industries, is the way that growth is created. And the evidence obviously again suggests, not only because not only because Adam Smith has shown it, but because the evidence 250 years later is that countries that are more closed, African countries in particular, Kenya in particular, don't do too well. So we must foster domestic industry, I agree, but the idea that you're fostering domestic industry means you think that that is the only one side. There has to be the consumers. Are consumers interested, or is that domestic industry working to make life more affordable for the consumers? So think about who's that is essential, because otherwise you're just actually protecting, you're just redistributing income from producers, from consumers to make producers who cannot consume. The third, to producers who are not producing competitively. I think the one other thing that you can talk about here is that ultimately, as a country, one of the ways to measure the performance of the country and its success and its prosperity is its ability to provide consumption. And how is consumption measured? Consumption in the end is measured by how much income is available to people, so that through that income they can do. So the amount of production that takes place is not as essential as how much consumption is ready to make that consumption occur, production relevant. So the standard of living and purchasing power of the citizens, I think, is one thing that we should think of as a major welfare measurement form. Specific subsidies are still given to the industry, and we all know it's maize, it's sugar, all these industries too. But I think it calls back to the fact that it affects what people call industrial policy, where government decides, look, if we protect this industry, Kenya is going to create an IT sector, or it's going to create one of those other fashionable sectors which every government thinks they can. I think Smith is reminding us that, look, these are just bounties that are being distributed to people. There's a cost to them borne by the whole society, and there's no evidence, but basically. So some things that are actually more horizontal as opposed to specific industries in helping, for instance, to make people have access to water, every Kenyan have access to electricity, have access to education, have access to those basic public goods, which will be covered in the next chapter, are essential. I think one other thing that it tells us is, if you look at the time of Smith and even today, in those days, fine, it was clear. England exports wool or exports cotton clothes, imports cotton and makes clothes or textiles and wool and sends it out. It was as if every country had, and every product had only one labor component and the raw material and those who make it and transport it. Today, I mean, production is so complicated and complex because of the division of labor, the pressure of specialization, that when you try to protect an industry by tariffs, for instance, or huge taxes to prevent imports, you might even be preventing because of global value chains or regional value chains. There's no single thing that's made in one country. So there's no such thing as a thing that's made in one country. It may look like a pencil, but the wood comes from one place, the lead comes from another place, the glue comes from another, and the people who shape it, the rubber tip comes from all different countries. So trying to protect one thing by saying, look, we are trying to prevent the import of this so that we can make pencils in our countries, actually, within the country, is actually a waste of time. So it shows that while Smith was right then, he's even more right now, because value chains, I mean, manufacturing, almost all sectors have been so distributed and dispersed geographically that a mercantilist model is actually not, is even less viable today than it was in Smith's time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kwame. Jairus, in Kenya, land and agriculture is a very sensitive subject. What ideas can we borrow from Adam Smith and apply in our contemporary society? You're muted.
I know you like to say that is the backbone of the economy, and you've seen subsidies going into agriculture and other things, but still we also have some bad things that we are doing, especially some restrictions. A few months ago, I think we had some discussion around, I think that's a bill that was in Parliament on agriculture that was like creating some restriction into some investment into some, or dealings in some other crops. And I think that's something that our policymakers will not pursue. But I think what we realize, or a summary of this chapter will tell us, is that those restrictions that will be put in place either from within, or as Kwame and Moses have argued, that restrict foreign trade or participation or export of some goods, and which we are doing so well, because if you look at our trade policies and laws, you will find that we have even levies that are put on goods that we're exporting. And if you look at it, this is not just about revenue for the sovereign. Actually, these are restrictions that that interfere with the trade and actually even agriculture. And you see that even means that if now export is being restricted, that means even production goes down, and that will have effects on other things. So policymakers would actually on agricultural systems or try at agricultural policies, then should be careful not to come up with those restrictions, because we know the effect that would have. And then the issue of I think this just goes back even to the beginning of the book on division of labor. I think with this understanding, then it's clear that in the different sectors, or in the different sectors, yes, there will be no preference for some sectors where we have that assumption that maybe they're not productive. If you look at manufacturing in Kenya today, even with around 7% of GDP contribution, actually more than half of that comes from processing of agricultural produce, which means there's some interdependence, and therefore when we have allocation of capital without restrictions in these different areas, then because of the dependence of the different sectors, then that would lead to more creation of wealth. But lastly, I would love to finish where Adam Smith finishes, that we really don't need to have a lot of interference of the sovereign or government into trade or even agriculture. Instead, the sovereign should provide just three important, or today could be more, very important public goods, and then that's protection of what will be important is for the states or the sovereign to focus on those very important public goods, including maintaining some public works and providing security, and not interfering a lot with trade with the economic activities of a country.
Thanks, Jairus. This last question is open to everyone and anyone. Do you think Adam Smith would have written about Kenya when, in case he lived in the 19th century and colonization was happening in Africa? What do you guys think? Would you think he would have included the colonization of Africa in his book? Moses, we can start with you since you did the chapter.
Well, to be honest, I don't know why Adam Smith left out Africa. Well, although the Europeans had not made much traction to Africa, maybe in the northern part of Africa, but definitely one of the things that Adam Smith criticized Europe for is having there been no reason to actually have colonies. Adam Smith seems not to have an issue with the Rome colonies and the Greek colonies, because after all, he observes that there's a lot of people is constrained in terms of territory, and people have to get that. And as far as these people are allowed to occupy these places, and these mother countries do not necessarily interfere with the freedom and the liberties of the people where they have gone, then that is okay, because it helps advance and build more prosperity, both for those who benefit from the production or not. But I think Adam Smith would still have had a problem with the extractive nature of African colonization, whereby the colonizers' intention is just to extract as much and then restrict trade to be exclusive, and also relegate human beings to subhuman, whereby they are controlled, they are not allowed to sell or exchange freely. They have to do it too. I think he would have mentioned that. And given the fact that he also Adam Smith mentions Vasco da Gama navigation, so he was probably close to mentioning Kenya, although I think it didn't, since it was not prominent then it didn't capture his attention. And of course, because of the basics of economics, that resources are scarce, so his time was scarce. Maybe writing about non-prominent things then escaped him then. That would be my thinking.
Anyone with an additional thought?
Yes, I think like another point is, okay, there are places in which he refers to Africa, but he does not, he refers to, sometimes savage tribes, referring to something like that, and alien, yes. But he does not refer to Africa in the model we realize today. And also it's possible, because at that time, African colonization was still at least 100 years away. This is a 1776 book. The formal colonization or the partition of Africa, the European partition of Africa, took place in 1885, right? So it's maybe 100. And one thing that maybe we might give him credit for, people say that Adam Smith did not credit sources, or rather his referencing system was not as efficient as the one we have today. But he refers, because there are places in which he refers to books and ordinances that the government had passed. So I think it was missed also perhaps because he was less familiar and less had been written for him to get the kind of content to be able to declare the facts that Melody is asking for. But that's clearly, yes, one area. Africa is not as present as it should have been given the size of the landmass and obviously the fact that global economy. He refers quite a lot to other places. He refers to Asia because that was known, especially China and even India, and refers to the Americas as well. Even to Russia, right? Because there's a place in which he talks about Russia, that empire too. So yeah, I think it's just because the historical record was not as abundant.
Okay.
I
So,
think at that time when there was superiority, where some people thought we are more superior than others, and therefore ideas could not come from slaves. I think he carries that also in this chapter and mentions in chapter 9 and mentions that actually, as Moses said, the way we treat the slaves even means even when they try to come up with an innovation on maybe making work easier, that will be treated as they're trying to avoid work. And looking at so if he was writing about Africa, maybe of course, maybe after colonization, and then the only way we are using Africans is that of course provide cheap labor that doesn't require a lot of skills, then would be limiting even their contribution to creation of wealth. And I think Kenya would actually be the country who would be referring to, or South Africa or Zimbabwe. Yeah, thank you.
okay, thanks, Darius. So on to the concluding remarks. I'll start with you, Moses, then Kwame, and end with you, Jairus. Moses, you can go first.
Sure. I think one of the things I learned here, and I think it's important, I reiterate that colonization, especially the barbaric treatment and coming and occupying, displacing people, is by no means a good thing. But one of the things we learn from this chapter is that by allowing people to move and take advantage of the available opportunity to be productive, more wealth was created, not just for themselves, but for other people. Adam Smith conceded that there was more enjoyment because people moved to new territory and turned what was less productive into to be more productive. This is important, especially now, if you're thinking as a Kenyan, where we are resistant of having foreigners come into the country and start production of some things, and also where we are limiting our movement of people in and across. And this is heavily in Europe now and in America, where they take movement of people to be a crime, whereas there is a risk of movement and that can be regulated against. The movement of people to places where they feel they can be more productive is important if the world is going to prosper. Because it's only, for example, if you consider Kenya, the only way we are taking advantage of the young population, which is claimed to be skilled, is by allowing technology to come into and capital to flow here. And the only way somebody is investing their capital into Kenya is if they are sure that they are a big portion of their production shall remain to be theirs. And therefore the proportion of the risk they take will be at least explained by the proportion of profit they'll make. And number two, that they are allowed to sell to as extensive market as possible, as available and as they can reach. Now, when a country decided that they're going to limit one movement of goods, both intermediate and final goods, It means that if you're investing your capital in Kenya, there's a risk that some of the things you need in your production line will come at you at a heavy cost, and that's discouraging. Number two is that maybe at some point you'll not be allowed to export some of your products because the government wants to control who you sell to. At the end of the day, that will keep the unemployment levels as high as they are in the country. So it's necessary that we actually sit back and realize that there is there is a case for allowing movement of people, freeing up movement of goods, and also allowing us to buy things that are not necessarily this assumption that why would we import toothpicks? Well, if somebody else can create toothpicks at a cheaper price, and I'm better placed to utilize my time in a different thing, then there's no problem with anybody importing toothpicks. By understanding that basics, that you're best placed to produce what will be more advantageous to you rather than the tiny and everything and make yourself feel I'm self-sufficient. It's something we need to realize, and it's important. And I think this is something that we need to learn from this chapter. Thanks.
Thanks, Moses. Kwame?
I'll finish with two things that Adam Smith taught here. First is that basically mercantilism has privileging consumers, producers, or disadvantaging consumers in the name of supporting production is a failed one, is bad in principle and law because it's coercion. You're coercing people to do what they would not do. So that's the first. But it's also poor principle because it's going to affect the building of wealth. So that's the first. The second thing that Adam Smith brings here is the question that consumption is actually a good thing. The reason for that is just basically as human beings, obviously part of our work and building of our wealth is so that we can consume. So it's not about hoarding goods, and we should have more respect for consumption than people actually do. And even when you defer consumption in terms of saving, it is so that that same produce can be consumed in the future. And the third one is that we have to be careful about government that do dishonor work. It is a bad thing for government to tell you, and I'll read this part just to show, that it says, but in the particular counties of Kent and Sussex, the restrictions are still more troublesome. Every owner of wool within 10 miles of the seacoast must give an account in writing. We are speaking about 1776. 3 days after shearing, that is 3 days after shaving his own sheep, to the next officer of the customs, of the number of his fleeces and the places where they are lodged. In other words, you have done your own job on your own land and we see this kind of coercive behavior in government, believing that people don't know what's best for them, even coming down to some of the ways in which tax bills and tax laws are defined, where government is very, very intrusive, when it could actually just collect taxes and let people decide their own. People who are prepared to work are usually not the ones who are causing mischief. But I think the good examples given here tell us that there's still more work to do to persuade governments to actually understand how they can help people to build wealth as opposed to using coercive techniques and methods. Thank you.
Thanks, Kwame. Jairus?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll say three things. First, he has demonstrated to us that actually wealth creation requires economic diversification. And he has gone into the division of labor, which takes us back to the beginning of the book. Number two, that will be on restrictions. It interferes with the allocation of capital and even would hurt even the sectors that we are trying to protect and promote, because you'll find that mostly they are connected to some way. And lastly, actually, this actually applies to us, and that is on the praise he gives to economists that the work they did by bringing into general discussion subjects that had not been explored actually brought change. When they went into that, we had change. We had some bad policy decisions being reversed in France, and I hope our work then we would continue to speak to those areas that we still feel have not been covered well or have not been understood well, and with the hope of course, of being able to achieve some change in a good direction. And lastly, I think that will be on the state just playing according to the rules and restricting themselves on the most important things that they're supposed to do, including provision of public goods and not interfering with economic activities. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Kwame, Moses, and Jairus for the insightful conversation. I hope through this discussion we've sparked your interest to grab a copy and read the book for yourself for more knowledge and insight on it. So you can catch up with us on Book 5 discussion, and you can also see the rest of the discussions on IEA Kenya's YouTube page. And we hope that you'll get more interest to fight for freedom and liberty